On June 25th, just 24 hours after Iran and Israel reached a ceasefire agreement, Iran's defense minister Aziz Nasirzadeh hurried off to Qingdao, China, to attend a Shanghai Cooperation Organization defense ministers meeting. On the surface, this was just a routine, multilateral diplomatic event. However, it was clear to those paying attention that Iran had just gone through a 12-day war with Israel and the US, during which its nuclear facilities were destroyed, its air defense systems were severely damaged, and domestic instability surged. Given these circumstances, Nasirzadeh's trip to China was anything but ordinary. It was an attempt to seek diplomatic support and strategic backing from the Chinese government. According to a report by Chinese state-run media People's Daily, Nasirzadeh expressed hope that China would act as an impartial mediator, playing a larger role in maintaining the ceasefire and easing regional tensions. This meant, first, he hoped China would continue condemning Israel and support Iran in both public opinion and policy. Second, he wanted China to go beyond mere words and take concrete action to help with the ceasefire and de-escalation. However, both China and Russia, two of Iran's so-called old allies, stood by and watched during critical moments of the conflict. Neither provided meaningful support. Iran's hope for China to ensure justice seemed like a far-fetched fantasy. Even Chinese media commented that Nasirzadeh's request was no longer just a simple hope, but rather a demand. They pointed out that his remarks bordered on moral coercion, with some labeling his expectations as unrealistic. It was clear that China had its own agenda. Helping or not helping was entirely up to them, and no amount of pleading from Iran would change that. As a result, Nasirzadeh's appeal for assistance was always destined to end in disappointment. Reports from Chinese media indicated that the SCO defense ministers meeting began on June 25th in Qingdao, with all 10 member countries represented. These members include the original founding members, China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and later members, India, Pakistan, Iran, and Belarus. This meeting had the largest attendance of defense ministers since the organization's formation. On the same day, Chinese officials arranged for the defense ministers to tour the 052D destroyer, the Kaifeng, which was docked at Qingdao port. Chinese media made a big deal of this, touting the chance for foreign leaders to get a close-up view of China's advanced ship design, cool weaponry, and command systems. The goal, however, was likely to promote military sales and show off Chinese military strength. Media outlets also reported that Iran's defense minister, Nasirzadeh, seemed particularly interested in the Hongqi 9B missile defense system aboard the ship. He reportedly stood in front of the phased array radar for 8 minutes, looking extremely serious and almost reverent. While one might think he was admiring the view, in reality, he was eyeing the advanced air defense weaponry he deeply desired. However, despite his apparent interest, he left without securing any deals. On June 28th, Russian media reported that Iran's defense minister had begun high-level discussions about purchasing China's J-10C fighter jets and advanced early warning systems, but Chinese media suggested that China might not agree to sell the J-10C to Iran. It said that during the waiting period for the group photo at the defense ministers' meeting, Iran's defense minister remained silent with a serious expression. It's likely that the purpose of his trip wasn't achieved, and he was disappointed. In contrast, the Russian and Indian defense ministers exchanged pleasantries, while the Indian and Pakistani ministers, meeting for the first time since their recent conflict, ignored each other. The SCO meeting was certainly lively. The war between Iran and Israel had not yet fully subsided. Russia and Ukraine were still locked in intense fighting, and India and Pakistan, having just fought a war, were attending the same event, which made the atmosphere tense. It was clear that the defense ministers had different agendas. Some, like Russia, Iran, and Pakistan, were seeking support. Others, like India, seemed to be attending just for the sake of presence. Several Central Asian countries likely hoped to gain some benefit from the meeting. During the meeting on June 26, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Dong made a statement, saying, "In times of complex and intertwined international situations, it is especially important for the SCO to play a stabilizing role. It's ironic, though, considering that the organization itself is unstable. How could it help stabilize the international situation?" Looking at the member countries, India, which leans more towards the US, stood out as somewhat of an outsider. Not only is India a rival to Pakistan, a close ally of China, but it also has territorial disputes and economic competition with China. As a result, India often finds it difficult to reach agreements with China on international matters. India attended the meeting, but it was unlikely to achieve its goals. Instead, it stirred up tensions. As expected, India refused to sign the joint statement, causing the meeting to end with no outcome. A source, speaking anonymously to the Associated Press, said that Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh believed the statement favored Pakistan's narrative, undermining India's position on terrorism and regional security. The statement failed to mention the shooting incident in Indian-controlled Kashmir in April, but did reference armed activities in Balochistan. Pakistan had repeatedly accused India of supporting the Balochistan independence movement, which India denied. In the end, the SCO, created by China and Russia, seems unlikely to make a significant impact. Iran had hoped that the organization would support it, but as China's state media pointed out, who would want to risk getting involved in Iran's nuclear crisis? After the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, China's propaganda began to quiet down. On Douyin, the same influencers who had passionately supported Iran before were now mocking and criticizing the rapid ceasefire, calling it a sign of Iran's surrendering to the U.S. When Iran's defense minister came to China seeking support, some influencers directly stated that China would not provide military aid to Iran.
6月26日，就是否考虑对伊朗
On June 26, China's defense ministry made it clear that China would not provide substantial military assistance to Iran. China had already expressed its position on the conflict between Iran and Israel through the SCO, and it was willing to play a constructive role on issues like Iran's nuclear program to maintain peace and stability in the Middle East. This statement effectively shattered Iran's hopes that China would act as a mediator. One blogger sarcastically remarked that according to military experts familiar with Iran, the country's pride led it to favor the West, dismissing China's technology and equipment. This arrogance caused Iran to miss out on great opportunities, despite having a chance to introduce advanced Chinese weapons like the J-10C fighter. They abandoned it in favor of Russia's Su-35. Last year at the Zhuhai Air Show, Iranian military representatives showed interest in the J-10C, but later they preferred the Russian fighter, believing it was superior in terms of range, stability, and weapon load. The result was that in the face of Israel's saturated attacks, Iran's F-14s and MiG-29s could only feign maneuvering outside missile range, while Russia's S-300 air defense systems became a joke, outdated equipment that couldn't even detect Israel's F-35 stealth fighters. Iran's defeat at the hands of the US and Israel has a clear reason behind it. Iran has no one to blame but itself. Iran aimed to inflict significant damage on Israel, but feared that the US would cut off its support. Confronting the US directly was too risky for Iran, as it feared being wiped out. While Iran gave more military aid to Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, it also worried about losing control over them. Khamenei's unpredictability has led Iran's people into a long-term standoff with the US and Israel. Now, expecting China to step in as a mediator for the conflict is simply Iran's weak response under pressure. Iran, a country with over 1,000 years of civilization, should ask itself why it had reached the point where it can no longer tolerate its own situation. Is the blame really solely on the US? Sacrificing for a short-term alliance and pushing away friends has clearly impacted Iran's future. From China's perspective, trying to help Iran through political negotiations to ease its crisis is already an act of kindness. The blogger's attitude shows that the China-Iran relationship is driven purely by economic interests, a temporary partnership based on mutual use, far from a strong alliance. Another blogger is even harsher, criticizing Iran for being inconsistent with China. When it needs China, it is warm and eager, but when it doesn't, it's cold and indifferent. The blogger also commented that if Iran asks China for help with post-war reconstruction, cooperation could happen, but Iran must pay up front for the deal.
伊朗根本就没有把中国的利益和诉求放在眼里面。
Iran has never prioritized China's interests. Over the years, China has worked hard to import oil from Iran and help with infrastructure projects, but Iran has always held into hopes of reconciliation with the West. At times, Iran has even taken positions in international forums that differ from China's, like doing UN Security Council votes on Syria. In human rights councils, Iran has failed to consistently support China on issues related to its core interests. These actions show that when cooperating with China, Iran always holds something back.
The blogger then asks how China differs from Iran. For example, all the weapons China has sold to Iran, like radar systems, command networks, drone platforms, and missile components, have been limited in scope. Even in battle, the world saw that Iran's defense systems were easily overwhelmed by Israeli attacks. Thus, these so-called alliances between dictatorial regimes are just superficial. There's no such thing as an unwavering ally. Evangeline Cheng, a researcher at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute, notes that China's Middle East policy is driven by economic interests, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative and oil imports. China heavily depends on Middle Eastern oil, with about half of its seaborne oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz. If Iran were to block the strait, China's energy security would be threatened. Therefore, China prefers to maintain stability in the Middle East rather than become embroiled in a direct confrontation between Iran and Israel or the U.S. Publicly supporting Iran could lead to U.S. sanctions and harm China's relationships with other key Middle Eastern energy partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Additionally, China's arms exports policy is very cautious. Although Iran urgently needs advanced air defense systems or offensive weapons, China is more likely to offer limited technical support or outdated equipment, not cutting-edge weapons. This limited aid is insufficient to meet Iran's immediate needs. In the end, China values Iran's cheap oil and uses the opportunity to sell subpar weapons and excess production capacity. As one Chinese commentator pointed out, China knows that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Iran's enemies, are crucial oil suppliers. If China overly favors Iran, it could jeopardize its energy strategy. Therefore, at critical moments, China prioritizes its own interests. If China's support for Iran is empty, Russia's attitude is even closer to cold. As another ally of Iran, Russia shares an anti-American stance with Iran on the surface, but in practice, its priorities clearly do not lie in the Middle East. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict has dragged Moscow into a deep quagmire, depleting its military resources. While Russia's military industry can provide some support to Iran, its main focus is on the battlefield in Ukraine, making it hard to offer Iran substantial assistance. Moreover, Russia's Middle East policy is also driven by its own interests. In some ways, a weakened Iran benefits Russia, not only because a weakened Iran will rely more on Russia's energy market and diplomatic support, but also because it strengthens Moscow's position in the bilateral relationship. Russia may sell some weapons to Iran or speak in its favor at the UN Security Council, but expecting Russia to go all out, providing an umbrella of protection for Iran, is unrealistic. In fact, not only are China and Russia unwilling to fully assist Iran now, but they have been relatively indifferent since the outbreak of the Iran-Israel conflict. According to foreign media reports, on the afternoon of June 19th, 6 days after Iran launched attacks on Iran's nuclear and political targets, CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Putin was attending an economic forum in his hometown of St. Petersburg. According to official reports, they directly discussed the Middle East issue. Putin stated that Russia was willing to mediate if necessary. Xi's remarks were more subtle, and his tone sounded more like that of a third party rather than a stakeholder who buys 95% of Iran's oil. Neither China nor Russia proposed any specific measures to support Iran, and the conversation quickly shifted to other topics. During the 12-day war, China was limited to verbal mediation. On June 22nd, China, Russia, and Pakistan jointly proposed a draft resolution at the UN Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Middle East, but there was no tangible action. After the ceasefire, China's foreign ministry and its permanent representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Li Song, strongly condemned the US and Israel strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, but these statements seemed more like routine formalities than sincere support for Iran. Iran's plight is not only due to the empty promises of its allies, but also its own strategic limitations. For a long time, Iran's hardline diplomacy and isolationist policies have with few friends in the international community. Both China and Russia see Iran as a pawn in the geopolitical game, not a true partner. When Iran sought to rely on China and Russia to get out of its current crisis, it found that the support of its so-called allies was nothing more than hollow promises. The Iranian defense minister's trip to Beijing was ostensibly to seek China's support, but in reality, it was Iran's desperate struggle. However, neither China nor Russia is likely to truly go to great lengths for Iran. China's interests and Russia's strategic goals have determined that at critical moments, they're more likely to stand by and watch.